we're a minute late. Welcome to the Local Planning Commission study session for July 8th, 2019. Tonight we've got a few items to go over dealing with the comprehensive plan, the envisioning process, future land use map. We're going to go over a few things afterwards. First off, I want to announce, and maybe some of you know, that John is going to be leaving us.
Hi.
So, well, John called me midweek last week, and he's going on a new adventure. He gave me a synopsis of where he's been in the past, which is quite exciting. You know, California, Hawaii, Colorado, and now he's going back to I think your roots, Northern California. Going to be communing with the redwoods, and any rate, but just want to make that announcement. You wrote a nice letter to council and staff and me. We're going to miss you.
Yeah, I'll miss all of you guys. It's been a great experience. I've learned a lot on Planning Commission, and was really grateful to be able to get back to the community a little bit and meet a lot of new people and get involved with some interesting work. Yeah, I sold a small business, so Altitude Paddleboards is now owned by an eager group of young folks that are local residents that they're going to do great with.
I think I've seen him.
Yeah, Willie and Willie Taylor and Chris Nisley.
I was at the View House looking down at them.
Made an exorbitant profit, I hope.
Oh, it's not exorbitant. It was more to pass it on to someone who has a passion, but yeah, it was worth something. So it was satisfying to be able to build a small business that somebody else wants to take on.
I've got a spot for you right here. Right there. That's chair.
Well, Craig, who's going to be slightly impacted by the announcement, of course he missed it.
Missed it.
You're going to be staying alternate number 1 for the rest of your life.
Yes.
Thank you.
You are moving up.
Oh.
At least that's typical. I guess council could make a different decision. But
You got promoted.
Yeah.
You
got promoted and you got promoted.
Yeah.
Okay, good idea.
Same pay.
So anyway, thank you for your service.
Absolutely.
I was in a very stable planning commission for the last few years, and you'll be missed. Your background in business has been helpful, working downtown, and your preparation was great always, and everybody's preparation has been great through the last 2 years. So anyway, good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So is this the last night?
This is my last night.
So no party, no nothing?
Well, that can happen later if you guys want to do something. But yeah, it's I've just got a lot of moving parts right now. I got to concentrate on, so it's best.
Great. So tonight we're going to be, like I said, going over more information on Littleton Envisioning. I'll turn it over to staff here. By the way, let me interrupt for a second. Can you give us just a synopsis of what happened with the Historic Preservation Board that you met with late this afternoon?
I can start and then we can dig a little deeper on some of them. So, good evening, Kathleen Osher, Manager of Innovation and Performance Excellence in the City Manager's Office. And this evening we met with the members of the Historical Preservation Board. One, to kind of recap the work of last year with the unifying vision, the guiding principles, and then 2, to kind of dig in on where we are with the future land use and community character map and get some input and feedback, particularly now that we're in the phase of putting words to paper, right? Helpful. I would say overall, I think it's an interesting dynamic a little bit with historical preservation, similar to some of the conversations we had about environmental concerns, that it doesn't come out in the words that people use, but as you read through the unifying vision and guiding principles, the history and the emphasis on that heritage and the importance of the history of both the civic leadership for the community and also in terms of those historical assets come clearly through in terms of how those community values align and also in the actual vision statement, the shared values, and the guiding principles. So I think that was maybe a little bit surprising to them. But I think that allowed us to kind of have a conversation about where the community is and then the necessity in kind of furthering that conversation about what would historic preservation look like Littleton style. And sort of the importance of doing some of the precursor work relative to having that community conversation. That would be my broad overview. And then do you want to dig in on any things that, I don't know if there were any surprises, but we spent a lot of time in this neck of the woods, Littleton Boulevard, particularly on the land use map, and talking about community character. I think they, I don't know how to describe their conversation about institutional exactly.
I think there's just, my sense was just to make sure historic preservation doesn't get short shrift. I felt like they feel like it doesn't always get the attention it needs, and for next steps past the comp plan. As far as the map, you wouldn't get a sense of history from a future land use map. You typically don't, but I mentioned that we are considering putting some of the districts on the map just for information. They don't necessarily have a zoning connection, but the discussion about calling out the courthouse, for example, maybe call out some landmarks just to know they're there. Beyond that, I think it was more just a chance for. We've talked to individual members and a couple of members at a time. We'd never been before the entire board, so it was just a good chance for them to ask questions, kind of like I want to do again tonight for this group. I've got some items I wanted to follow up on from the joint leadership workshop a couple of weeks ago, but then open forum again, just things that may be coming around.
Any questions about historic preservation meeting?
I will add one more thing on the historic preservation. It was an interesting conversation about Littleton Boulevard and the role of the mid-century modern architecture and what do you do with that, and does the mixed-use urban corridor character allow the preservation of those mid-century modern buildings. So I think just interesting in how we end up defining that mixed-use urban corridor, and also in other conversations that I've heard there is some concern isn't the right word, but conversations around what does mixed-use urban corridor mean, and it's on a lot of very different corridors.
Right. And what we've talked about is with the charge to not have 40 categories on the map, using the text of the plan to talk about how the different areas within that designation are different, the different corridors. So part of the discussion of Littleton Boulevard is trying to recapture my answer to one of the questions.
You talked about how basically preserving it, working with it, rather than having non-functional corridor.
Yes. How do you enliven and make that a vital corridor within Littleton for residents and for walking and for whether it's restaurants, whether it's shopping, culture, and preserve those historical elements as part of that. But if you just have the historical elements in a dead corridor, not much is going to happen anyway. So I think they'll be even more at risk in a corridor that's doesn't have a whole lot going on parts of it. You know, there's some vacancy or. So I think that's kind of the discussion.
Yeah. Was there pushback to infill?
Again, it's that urban character discussion that, as we've talked about, that there's different levels, that this isn't bring it to the street. The term canyon was used, which I use a lot. yeah, you don't want to get to a point on a street where it's just hemmed in and tall buildings, but I don't see that market-wise or even the dimensions of that street. You're not going to enclose that street with buildings, but some of the discussion that, yeah, some of the mid-century buildings were set back. My focus is always on parking. And so one of the comments was, well, even where you have some parking out front, that can be closed off at times to be a public activity space or whatever. My point, which they ultimately agreed with, was, yeah, 20, 25 spaces, not 300 spaces. Because that's our experience. And there was a comment about Anytown USA, that's what we want to avoid in the future if Littleton Boulevard redevelops and turns over. My point is, that's what you have on stretches of it today is the grocery store, old anchored retail center. Our experience is when it's auto-oriented development, the buildings are back from the street, architecture goes out the window, it's all about parking and signs. And that was one of the comments that I guess at some point in the past, with sign regulations and some of even the old signs that went with those buildings.
Regulations, might not have been too many regulations at all.
That's what's interesting about those particular buildings is that character didn't go out the window yet, right? So even though they're set back and they have parking in front, they have interesting character that provides some interest in that corridor. And is there a possibility for them to be adapted to other uses so that they invigorate the corridor?
Are there any designations for those? Are there any potential designations for them?
For the
I don't
mid-century
know what
modern.
that would be.
We did
yes.
there's a whole plan, an inventory of it. So the next step would be for seeking designation.
Like a historic designation, or I don't know what else that might be.
There are varying levels of designation. I mean, and that can even be part of really a more detailed plan of historic preservation, actually having a historic preservation plan.
Did the board display, did the Historic Preservation Board display any interest in or movement in going that direction?
I think in the past they have. I mean, it really wasn't a conversation this evening about, doing designation. But I mean, part of the conversation was, how does historic urban fit with urban transitional or urban mixed use? So I thought that was an interesting observation.
And I
too.
think probably that character piece that's so much a part of urban in the context is that it introduces a greater level of walkability, right? And so it's how do you balance those gems of architectural significance and historical significance with that desire to create something that's more walkable. And so I think that's where we kind of landed on that conversation. I think there's a desire on the part of the board to do some of that work, something like a historical preservation plan. I think that there's some precursor steps that we would benefit from before getting to that, but
one of them being
that'll
the
be
comp
right, those will be some of those policy decisions that, particularly when it comes to budgeting, that council will be grappling with.
How do other communities address this issue? This can't be the first time this has come up. I'm familiar with Palm Springs in California, which has got an awesome number of mid-century modern buildings in a relatively urban area, and it works.
Yeah, what we were talking about was, and this is the language we're writing into the plan, the draft, is yeah, you could see redevelopment along a corridor like this through zoning, through other tools. You could incentivize that redevelop half a block or a portion of an area that has one of those buildings. We're going to incentivize that you keep that, of course, that architecture, but then activate it, make it part of something bigger. So it's not just these standalone pieces along a kind of a troubled corridor in places. So that was the discussion there. Yeah, as far as the map, I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion that sometimes as we're talking about here, we call out corridor overlays or things like that that exist on a future land use map just for information, but it's historic, like a National Register district doesn't really tie into zoning or land use. It's more of a, it has other implications, tax credits and things like that. So.
But I think where we left everything with them is that the draft will be available for their August meeting. So there's an opportunity for them to do some of that discussion around that, individual members to offer those comments, as well as the group as a whole to have a discussion. I think they meet on the 19th of August. And so, the draft that you'll be discussing on the 13th will be available for them to kind of dig in a little bit deeper. I think their desire is to see that connection to historical preservation in terms of some of those policy level statements. And so I think that's what they'll be using their lens to really make sure that they see the seeds towards the types of things that they might want to look at in the future, like a historical preservation plan. So I think that's it was good timing to come and do that recap and kind of dig in a little bit on where we are, and then just sort of see that idea that it's the perfect moment to now document and sit down and make sure that you see yourselves in it.
Well, you brought up in the beginning a lot of questions looking for the right answers. And I do agree with your point that you have some mid-century, it's called semi-gems, or some of them are gems. But the corridor is, quite frankly, stodgy. How do you bring it together? How do you make it walkable? How do you make it viable into the 21st century? So a couple of other things. I would suggest that you do a separate map for, rather than trying to blend it into this use map, have a separate map of historic structures. And
part of the existing?
Sorry?
The existing land use?
That's a, as you may remember, that's a pretty busy map as it is.
Yeah. So that's one item. And you had given us last time the comprehensive plan outline, or I call it a skeletal outline. And I'm wondering, where does talking about Littleton's history come into play? It seems maybe on page 2, number 8, special areas and design. Is that where it would come up?
It's there, and it's in the recreation amenities section. We're going to talk about, because it's one of your state mandates is to talk about tourism in the comprehensive plan. So we're going to talk about it there, how that draws people, and is an aspect of Littleton.
It's very important. I would not keep it as a half-page short shrift. Get it over with and move on to something else that deserves some length. Okay. Any other?
Yeah, just one other comment, kind of going on to the idea of those mid-centuries that are set back a little bit. I think that's a really great idea to make it more pedestrian friendly and walkable by adding some kind of community character, whether it's benches or trees, or, I mean, obviously you have to allow them to have their parking if that's where their designated parking is. But when you mix it to take an area that's not activated to be pedestrian and just add a few little things like that, it can just change the entire character in front of that building to create what we were talking about.
Okay. Thanks for the update on the 4:30 meeting. Let's go ahead, Gary. You were going to start talking about leftovers or things from our joint session.
So here's the big one. This is partly because I wasn't at that table, but the accessory dwelling unit issue. We had some pushback from several influential members of the workshop, and I kind of look at it just like the housing study. I don't know if everybody had a chance to dig into the housing study. Accessory dwelling units is mentioned in there as one of your tools for how to deal with more housing availability and affordability, but it's just in the list. It's not dwelled on. Now, we weren't going to put in the plan, you must have accessory dwelling units, they must be all over the city. So just want to kind of get your sense of that discussion, and as we captured in our notes from that night, there was a pretty wide spectrum of opinion, but I just don't want to avoid the issue entirely. So I just want to get a sense of this group of, I think we need to bring it up in the housing section of the comp plan, that it's in the toolbox, it should be part of the zoning discussion. It's not saying you must do this or the zoning has to have an accessory dwelling unit component. I think it needs to be part of the discussion.
No, it's verboten. No, exactly right. You have to have it aired out, and that's part of the process for the community to decide how that's ultimately going to look.
I think one of the biggest things that we have to think of with the accessory dwelling units is it does not change the character of that community. You know, we don't want it to become auto-urban if it's not that kind of a character. We don't want to add extra cars. We don't want to add, you know, changing something that wants to stay suburban to stay suburban. So there's probably places where ADUs work and ADUs don't work. Distinguishing in our community where they work versus where they don't work would be, I think, a big part of how we want to address ADUs.
Continue on that theme, that there's certain areas where they would certainly be appropriate, and you know, there's a lot of alley-loaded areas in the northeast part of the city which might be appropriate to have an ADU based along the alleyway, or a laneway unit as they call them in other communities. And even some of the suburban areas are estate residential. I think I've mentioned the whole carriage house concept. You've already got potentially large agricultural outbuildings on some of these parcels, and if one is home to an au pair or elderly relative, is that such a bad thing for those particular contexts?
Well, I see it as not a citywide allowance of it. It would perhaps happen in certain areas. I don't know if this group in the time allowed can make that decision. It needs a more vigorous discussion by the citizens of the city as to, you know, if we allow it, where, how big, how tall, how close to the neighbor, what happens with the shadows, how many square feet. List is quite long. But it needs more vigorous discussion than the time we have left. But it needs to be brought up. And there was talk, we had talked about this before, towards the end of this comp plan, there's a section on unresolved issues, things that are hot button issues to be brought up in the future. Yeah, that's one of them.
I think it is a difficult discussion that has to be had with the community. I think there's opportunities to correlate it with pros and cons. I think that it seems like in our conversation, it was at a very high level. It's like people had already made up their minds. It's like, well, ADUs, you know, here's a list of issues that other communities have had with it. We don't want to go there. And, you know, I think correlating it with what the presentation that we had about the demographics of Littleton, that we're going to acquire, 20,000 more people in the next 10 years or whatever, where are they all going to go? And how, what are some good examples of the pros that ADUs brought to communities, about the parking issues and the bad neighbor, too many people. There's pros too that we're not talking about. So if we can have a more balanced discussion about pros and cons, maybe it does go to the parking lot. Maybe it's more allowed than it is encouraged at some point. Maybe it's just because at some point I think there was the example of growing up back east where people do it because they have no choice. When I got married, we lived in a legal apartment on the second floor of a suburban home because that's all we could afford. And we're getting to that point here, so there's an economic argument there. So if we don't allow ADUs here, people are going to do it anyway. Like Airbnb.
So just continue the way we are.
And that was part of the discussion. I think there was some hangover from just going through the short-term rental discussion. As I've mentioned in other conversations, just putting limitations, as we've done in other places through zoning, that you can't have a separate outside entry and you can't have a separate utility meter. Those couple of things can say you're not renting to an outsider. I mean, it's going to be a relative, a boomerang kid coming back, you know.
It's attached. It has an entryway from the old house to the new. You could place curbs on it.
So yeah, not looking for this group to again set the parameters, but just I think it needs to be part of the conversation. And I'm not calling anybody out that was concerned about the negative aspects, but one of the comments was it's people just trying to make money. Absolutely. People trying to stay in their home, pay their taxes, and that's been a theme of the vision process and comp plan discussions of how do you keep this an inclusive community and a place where people can age in place, stay in the community. So absolutely, people are trying to get some income and help pay their taxes.
And the mortgage.
So that's basically what I was looking for. But I just, one thing we were trying to do in that conversation is hit on some of those typical parameters and just the location question. Typically, it's not wide open just anywhere in the city. It would be for certain areas that can handle it. Yeah, and just because I've highlighted that double driveways going to even triple driveways, how that can take away from front yard green and openness, and that's another side effect if you have another tenant is need another space for a car up front. So all it's perfect. It's one of those perfect topics for your zoning discussion. So do we go there? How far? Where do we set the parameters? But the comp plan can just say it's on the list of items that needs some discussion as part of the housing toolkit.
I just designed an addition where I could have done it's a triple garage, and I could have done a triple driveway, and I remember you talking about it, so I kept it narrow. And then to cast the Gary seal of approval, it does widen as you get close to the door. So
my work is done.
Hate to admit the planner knows more than the architect.
He knows more.
More sensitive.
Just take it. Just take it. Just walk away to
just back to the ADU for a second. It was all over the place, obviously, at our joint session. Do you have enough here? You need to talk about it. It has to come up. But you can talk about the pros, the cons, without you being the arbiter of what Littleton's going to have. You can't do that.
Where I'm going is, some of your elected officials said absolutely not. So I'm not looking for this group to, at that point when it comes before them, to say, oh yeah, we want that too. But just that there's variety of opinion on this, and it needs to be part of the discussion. As somebody said, it's in the housing study. So that's my foothold of it needs to be part of your things you consider of how to deal with housing challenges.
So Kathleen, in your conversations with the community, what have you heard of ADUs and how the community feels about it?
it hasn't come up. Yeah, ADUs, accessory dwelling units. I think things like carriage homes or, and obviously we heard a lot of feedback on short-term rentals, but it is not something that unprompted comes up as a desire. I think the experience with other neighbors around the region, as the affordability becomes more and more a challenge, it has creeped into the sort of layman's conversation. So
it's the lowest hanging fruit to start to address the affordable housing issue.
And I think from the housing study work, so the first iteration, right, it was one of the ideas that polled least. It'd be interesting to know how that's evolved.
Yeah.
In terms of being a good fit within Littleton.
So if we want to get the community's input, this is something we're going to have to specifically ask about,
yes.
Not just let it come up in conversation.
And we've really focused the community conversation on this character, sort of the lexicon of it. I think when we've sat down with the map and had that conversation with the community, I think the thing that resonates most is that idea of balance, the pie charts, right? Like, so when you talk about suburban character, it's all three are almost equally in balance. right? You have a little pavement, you have a little green, you have a little building, that balance. And so that seems to resonate with people in terms of kind of digging in on what these characters mean. Because character is, in layman's speak, like when you're out talking, like, Littleton has fabulous character. Well, what does that mean, right? And part of, our challenge with the vision and guiding principles was we heard a lot about the small town feel. What does that mean, right? And so trying to dig a little bit deeper and understand the values piece of that, but then also understand, I don't know, for lack of a better word, the optics of that. Like, what are the key elements that make it small town feel for you? And so if you remember in the vision, that was that graphic where there was, here, I've got one right here. It's like my traveling one, where the graphics, and then we were showing how that small town feel, how that gets defined and is uniquely a Littleton idea. So,
and I think something for us, kind of going a little bit higher here, as we're starting to drill down into specific topics and we're getting into the framework, keeping those 5 lenses, our guiding principles, in mind. And as we're talking about things, how do those guiding principles apply? How are we translating that into policy? So, just kind of a...
Test your knowledge. State the 5 principles, please.
Active, engaged, authentic, connected, and anchored. That's the
Cheat sheet there, okay. No, Bruce would gag on that, but...
Yeah, I mean, HPV kind of brought it up, like, what do we mean by authentic? And, their take on authentic. And it is in the definition that is in that document. It has the historic character, the architectural heritage. So there's that aspect of it. But as we're talking about ADUs, I think that the conversation really is, it needs to be an option that is put forth in the comp plan. How it gets translated is really going to fall to the zoning code.
And as someone mentioned, it needs to be framed with education and examples, that it's not just an abstract conversation. What we see is typically bringing renters into an ownership environment is a negative, and people I don't know are suddenly in my neighborhood, and then density and all the side effects, parking, more trash, cans out front, whatever.
I think one of the ways to bring those specifics in would just be some examples of Littleton. Like, where does an ADU kind of naturally fall in? The certain neighborhoods that have a rear alleyway with a detached garage. Okay, they're already there, here and there, and then they naturally, those homeowners tend to want to do that with their detached garage. So that's a natural, in my opinion, areas, those lots where ADUs would kind of naturally fall in. Then beyond that, lots that have a lot of space or do allow detached garages. Where those aren't allowed, where there's not a lot of space, where detached garages are not allowed, then it's not as conducive to it. Because it's obtrusive to the existing use.
Or it's not as a detached ADU, but you can also have an ADU that is part of your...
Right, but then it starts to become a little bit more intrusive, perhaps, to the neighborhood character, unless it's within the existing.
Well, and I think the guidance from the housing study, a lot of the conversation is around the changing demographics and recognizing those, the affordability questions, and kind of finding those places where it's appropriate and fits. So I think that helps guide some of the conversation, but there's no denying that the comprehensive plan is going to be that 30,000-foot view, right? And it's going to point to tools that we could potentially use, but that is going to require a lot more conversation when you get into zoning and code. And that's where the detail comes in.
I think the discussion will intensify during the rewrite of the zoning code.
Correct.
And perhaps decisions made then, or at least to get the ball rolling to even go to a vote before the public, or really gather a lot of information over the course of a year or two. Have a test case or a test area and see how it works out, etc.
Yeah, and I think there's some indication from other communities that addressing that first before doing short-term rental set you up for a better community conversation. I mean, that still remains to be seen if that would be the approach that we would take, but I think that having a good sense of what you would do with ADUs aids you in then having a short-term rental conversation and making sure that you stay sort of in lockstep where the community values are and that conversation.
And I wonder what the role of design guidelines is in that whole conversation, because I think the success of an ADU zoning, or a zoning that allows ADUs, is predicated on the ability to enforce good design that maintains that character in each district.
Well, and that might very well be where you did downtown. You get away from guidelines and they become design standards.
Yeah.
It can be very similar to home occupations, which I can't remember what your zoning, how that handles that, if it does, but not visible from the street, no separate entry, no extra parking. I mean, it can be a lot of the same principles.
Well, when I've done ADUs, and I've done 8 or 9 of them or so now, it's if I do them in Denver, I always only half-jokingly say the ADU was designed by Denver zoning. I'm just kind of along for the ride, make sure it doesn't leak and the foundation doesn't collapse. So there are a lot of regulations you can add to it as far as heights, where it is, boat planes, complement the style of existing house. I mean, that you could have 3 pages of regulations. Maximum size.
So just somebody mentioned examples. I'm sure there's others out there, but one that caught my eye. This is the in Northeast Littleton, the Norgren large block, where is it townhomes that are
Cityscape.
But it's across from the charter school. This row of homes here. Mm-hmm. I was driving by one day, and it's that one right there. People were sitting on that porch, and we waved at each other. And so it's over the garage. Anytime I see space over the garage, I'm thinking, if it's not storage or a game room, somebody's in there, I'm sure. And the fact that it's set back from the street helps, I think. More driveway to handle an additional car. So anyway, that's one example that caught my eye. It's
a big garage.
Yeah.
Big house, yep. All right, let's see. Go back to my list. One of the things we had put out there as a discussion item was this idea of, because of Littleton's fiscal outlook and needing to be able to afford all the services it provides down the road, we asked the question of, should you really try and draw the line on anything that's non-residential today? Really think about giving it up. So I was just curious of your time on the commission. Have you faced maybe that question? And I think Mark may have said yes, where that was part of the zoning change discussion of that we're giving up some non-residential property to a residential use. But I was just curious whether that's been a decision factor even up to this point. Let me put it this way. So often you're looking at a zoning case, a rezoning, that particular property, the immediate vicinity, but to think about it in terms of the entire city, that we've got to think lot by lot as we give up property to residential use, that we're just adding to the public service burden, maybe giving up revenue potential.
I think of some of these that have been parcels that, for a variety of reasons, were originally zoned commercial but aren't viable commercial parcels the way things evolved. And they're not all that way, but certainly on occasion you get a parcel that just isn't going to do what it was originally intended. And I guess the other side of it is, presupposes that we continue to seek sales tax revenue as the principal source of revenue income for the community. I mean, given the way demographics are changing, the way retail is changing, e-commerce and so forth and so on, that has its own perils. And so some dovetailing of what you just described with looking at parcels, not wanting to see, and I think incredibly there's been a lot of conversation on making sure, for example, Littleton Village had commercial parcels out on Broadway as opposed to the whole thing was just residential, for example, when that was done a number of years ago. But considering what the community's desires are with respect to balancing services and revenue, it is an interesting question. And how do we want to pay for what we want? What do we want? And then do you really want it to be sort of a variable revenue kind of thing that can go up and down with economic cycle and so forth and so on?
I don't think we can poo-poo the retail as if, e-commerce is taking it over. I'm not saying that's what you said. You just made me go on to another train of thought.
Sure. But
like in Highland Ranch, where they are just booming with their retail and that, up by Lucent and all that, we've actually lost, like old Chicago, who went up over there. So I think we need to look at it as in a city is, why is that being so successful? That why can't we bring that into our own city to revitalize our own retail or economic centers in that sense? Because they're there and they're working and they're very successful. So why there? That's not that far away from Littleton. Again, we won't be changing our way of financing things with sale tax overnight. If there's changes, it's great, but that takes time, and we still have to make sure that right where we are now stays viable. And giving up that land to build houses where we take away from the income and then add the burden of cost, that has to be balanced. And that's part of what the comp plan is going to be, correct, Terry, where you talk about the economics of a community and stuff, because we can't shoot ourselves in the foot.
That's where I'm going with this, is I picture a policy statement in the economic development section that just says succinctly something to the effect of that should be a consideration in zoning decisions that think about the citywide mix of land uses. Zoning ordinances sometimes have a list of 8 or 10 items that the planning commission has to consider for a zone change, and I could see that just being another item on the list if it's not already called out. That just think about the fiscal implications for the city.
That has been brought up.
I'm sorry to interrupt. With Bruce's caveat that yes, there will be cases where it doesn't make sense for other reasons. So, but you've thought through those reasons. And
specifically to what you're saying, that has been brought up in planning commission meetings about the economics, and conversation that went then to was at some point in the past it doesn't seem to be important anymore. And those conversations have occurred, and I think that's detrimental to our community to not consider how is it going to affect us economically.
I'm trying to think of the conversation I had where it wasn't brought up, the economic of it. If you had been here 20 years ago doing this, what we're doing right now, your comp plans would be in one statement. No conversion of commercial zoning to residential zoning. There was a line in the same, but in specific areas we have crossed that line and said, okay, this was pie in the sky. No retail is going to go into this area. Let's consider another best use. So that's been sprinkled around our community over the years. So quite frankly, there's not that much space left where that discussion is going to happen. We're pretty well set, except for a few smattering parcels.
But it is redevelopment. That's where.
Yeah. Oh yes.
Very much so.
Yeah. Mixed use. Broadway, for instance. What do you do? The car dealerships go, for instance. Not that they're going anywhere, but they did. what happens to that property?
This wasn't necessarily a zoning change, but it was in the central business district. It was a PD overlay where it was an L-shaped office building that got converted to townhomes, or rather raised and then turned into townhomes. Now that was under the existing zoning, so it wasn't allowed use with a PD overlay, but one thing about a lot of the residential that's been going in downtown is anecdotally talking to some of the merchants, they've noticed increases in foot traffic over time with all the extra residents in close proximity, which, you could make the leap and say that, a mix of uses can be beneficial for the economics of a project and the survivability. I look down one of the corridors we talk about it. I won't say it's trouble, but there are some areas that are vacant. We've had that Champ oil change place vacant for the better part of 3 years since they relocated down to Highlands Ranch, and that may be zoned commercial. It may be earning some commercial property taxes, but it's not doing a whole lot right now.
Yeah. The old, the market has spoken basically in some areas for sure.
Yeah, sounds like an opportunity for another Starbucks.
Only be a few blocks away.
Right across the street.
Sort of bar hopping, you go Starbucks hopping.
And really, that's a big part of that core mixed-use designation. That rationale is calling it, and so that policy statement probably needs to be worded differently and bring in the balance concept. But it's saying we have tax-based needs and we have housing needs in this community, and boy, if you can hit them both, or if you're doing a single use, standalone use, just that it makes sense with what we need in this community in terms of retail and housing options. And if you can put them together, even better.
I would say, you could put your feet on the ground, stomp and say, sorry, the zoning will not change, and nothing happens to the site for the Champ oil lube place that sits vacant for another 12 years. And it's an eyesore now, and increasingly becomes a worse eyesore.
I'm glad you brought that up about a very stark statement, because we've seen that in other cities. It's like, there's the commission just is no longer advisory. They're just stomping boxes. Oh, we can't do that.
I think if the focus is on where that commercial is given up, that there's an emphasis on mixed use, so that not all of it goes away. It's a partial solution for some sites.
I think that economic analysis for a lot of cities in the region right now is translated into understanding what cannot go away, right? The dependence on sales tax is not unique to our city. And so understanding those pieces and understanding what that means in terms of your flexibility. And so I think that that's been a powerful way for some of the cities in the region to kind of at least figure out where they have that flexibility and knowing where the lion's share of that income or revenue is coming from, and understanding the importance of doing what it takes, economic development, other tools to keep those.
Is there a way of modeling that, Kathleen? Sort of like a formula that says, for a city this size, you need to preserve this amount of square foot of commercial property to sustain your...
The most recent conversation I had was relative to Superior, so not a huge city, right? I don't know how their population lines up with ours right now. It might be slightly larger.
Faster growing.
Yeah. And all of the things that they said, we can't lose these 3 things, or 3 things we don't have. You could probably guess them. Whole Foods, Target, and what was the third one? I don't remember. But, so I think that changed the policy conversation for the town of Superior. Some of the work that the city's looking at doing to build on the fiscal impact analysis will be creating a more dynamic economic model, so that then we have that ability to recalibrate more continually, right? Like, so you could put a whole new set of inputs, you could put a project, you could put a infrastructure investment, and see what that model produces. So building the nuts and bolts piece so that we have that flexibility internally. So that's something that at least our economic development team is exploring. I don't with the priority-based budgeting discussion, that becomes sort of a policy level conversation, I think, for council to decide how that gets invested in. But I think there are a few examples of where that modeling piece has been really helpful in a dynamic way, right? Because this will be sort of a static snapshot in time and kind of help, I guess, validate some of those policy statements. Is that a fair way to?
One point about mixed use. If we're going to say mixed use corridors, et cetera, real mixed use, make it a point. Not, I'm going to put 200 apartment units and we'll throw in a 800 square foot Starbucks. That's not mixed use. Having a road divide the property in half and a few bones of retail on the east side and west side, a massive amount of homes. That's not mixed use. True mixed use.
We call it multiple use.
Okay.
It's not mixed use.
Okay.
They didn't mix them. They just stuck them on the landscape.
Got corridor mixed use here. Man, do you need to change that?
Oh, right. I just meant when people come in with applications and show pods of use. That's not mixed use. That's just a bunch of uses on a site. The next one I wanted to ask about, let me get my list. It's almost like the end of the list we were working off of the last few meetings, one of those big picture ones. This was Councilmember Cole's comment, and talking about Northeast Littleton. How do you achieve quality there without pricing out the people who are there now? So I was curious, we don't need to beat up on the current project that's happening there, the townhome project, but as an example, is that going to pass that test, or is even that project kind of pushing the limits of what's affordable, or setting off a chain reaction if other properties start to turn over?
Well, we had this discussion over, Robin, you and I, over coffee.
Maybe we shouldn't be talking about a specific project that's in the pipeline, or is it through the pipeline?
Actually, we'll come back to Planning Commission,
yeah,
so
we probably should.
We can talk about it generally. I can't talk specifics of it, but I think where Mark was going to go is how do the economics of it weigh in? Meaning the economics on the developer side. For them to make a project work, they would argue that they have to charge a certain amount just to cover their costs. And I think how does that get balanced out in a comp plan of the dollars and cents of construction? I think there's an education piece that needs to occur even with the community at large, city council, planning commission, of what does it take to build right now? What are those hard costs that you cannot avoid? And therefore, that's what starts driving up the cost of housing right now.
We don't have like a fee in lieu of for affordable housing, do we? I don't think we do.
We don't have policies like that.
But would that be a candidate here?
Absolutely.
Regarding going to be market rate, you're required to put in a certain amount of affordable, and if you can't, then it's fee in lieu of, right? Or it goes to it.
If we have it in place.
Well, I've mentioned before, my opinion is, you either help the supply side, the developer, you subsidize his costs, or you subsidize the residents. If they can afford what's built market rate, those are the options, and there's all these varieties of programs and tools that we use on the public side to make that happen. But yeah, the ground and the cost of development, construction, labor costs, materials, there's a certain break-even point of development. And so big question, I'm just tossing it out there, but I think that's the discussion is, and it's in the housing study partly, you can't avoid gentrification. I mean, there's a bunch of people out here in the world trying to make money, and property values rise, and costs of government rise, and taxes go up. But so you've got to be subsidizing somebody to keep an area from losing some of its current residents.
Well, I guess any question would be, do you know what the property ownership versus rental breakdown looks like in that area? On the one hand, you'd argue...
I think it's our highest rental area.
Huh?
I think it's our highest rental area.
That's probably legitimate, but some of that has to do with...
Do I have data to back that up? No.
But who owns it?
Well, but the question is, you've got apartments on towers that, for example, South Metro Housing owns
quite a few.
Yeah, and a lot of those are subsidized.
Correct.
And they've just also been redeveloped over the last few years. At least a few of them have been. I guess I was thinking more in terms of some of the housing, single-family homes to the north or into the north and west of this particular site. I don't know if, that area up in there, if that's an area that at this juncture probably has some level of affordability to it. Do we have a sense of, is there a large swath of rental properties in that location versus owner-occupied? The answer may change depending on what that looks like.
And with the market cycles, just people that end up renting out their house.
Well,
I think something else to think about is where we have some control is you'll see a house that's affordable scraped, and then big townhouses that are $750 and above put in place. So where's the balance that we have in a community where we don't lose that affordable house to something that's too expensive for the average person? Or also, do the houses that are being built, do they have to be so huge? You build a smaller house, like when I'm growing up, there was a lot of 1,000-square-foot homes. I think, the first house that my family had is like 800 square foot. There's 3 of us kids. It was a little small, but you had those options of buying a smaller house versus just trying to start in that 2,500 square foot home. So where do we come in supporting to build houses that aren't the huge mammoth houses, or even just a larger home and have some starter homes? We hear about starter homes. We hear about people wanting patio homes. Those houses just don't cost as much because they're just not as big. So, there's a balance between what gets built and do we just allow someone, I want to build this big, huge house because it's going to make me a lot of money versus, our community needs something more along these lines, which aren't as expensive homes. Just something to think about, too.
And that touches on the character. I think I brought up there's a house that either got scraped or was a vacant lot that's just south of Powers on Datura, and they're putting in a house that is not going to be in character with that street frontage. It's going to have, on an alley-loaded street, it's going to have a 2-car garage on the front, it looks like, and the garage dominates the face of the home. It's much larger than the surrounding homes. So I think you had talked about it's very possible to create zoning that emphasizes character and would prohibit that sort of thing, or require the garage at the back, require maximum size for that area potentially. I mean, those are all probably details that are too granular for the comp plan level, but
it's how we usually operate in this country. You have to see something, the bad thing happen, and then, we better do something about that.
Yeah, you can't get to the zoning changes quick enough when things like that are happening.
I think our most recent conversation with South Metro Housing, particularly in that part, they said affordable by default, and that they thought zoning could make an impact. Like catalyzing some of the privately owned.
Say that again.
That zoning could make an impact. So I think that continues to elevate Littleton Boulevard.
One other thing that might affect some of the housing values in that area, you can see that arched street there. I believe most of that and the surrounding properties are in the 100-year floodplain.
The curved street, Barry?
Yeah.
How do we throw a curve in there?
Following the old creek that was there.
Probably.
Built in the
water don't was it? Yeah.
Well, can I bring up some economic reality here? You want affordable housing, or you got one of two choices. You either heavily subsidize it, either with a developer or subsidizing homeowners that are willing to buy or rent, or you get more density in smaller units because the economics doesn't support low-cost housing because of the low cost of land, the cost of construction, cost of permits. There's 8 or 9 more items that add to the cost of building. So either you become a dictator and Littleton buys all the residences, and then they can decide, well, we're going to allow 800 square foot houses, or we're going to, you can do there's some zoning things you can do that are appropriate. I agree with you there. But there's economic reality and the fact that if I own my place, I'm not going to sell to the cheapest guy just because I'm nice. I'm going to sell it for the highest price because that's my retirement program.
Or you can
How do you combat that? What's that?
Or you could add a unit on your lot.
Yeah.
Sort of this accessory to the dwelling unit that's already there.
Thank you.
But the other reality is that the market is going to dictate the demand for those homes and what people want. If you build something, they don't like it, they're not going to buy it. It doesn't matter.
I mean, nobody's...
So we can't dictate that either.
Yeah, so in the outline, I've mentioned before, we like to divide action items in the plan into 5 categories. See if I can remember my 5. Capital improvements, programs, initiatives, regulations and standards, partnerships, needs more study, follow-up studies, more detailed studies. So this is an area where the land use map is pointing toward this residential mix category that would be more of a flexible zoning if that follows through on the one side. So that's the regulation action to revisit the zoning for that area. But there needs to be a program initiative component that South Metro, the public sector, has to play a role if you're not going to lose some of the people that live there right now. So it can't be just market driven and driven by zoning.
But you're not getting frisky with this, in my opinion, with this land use map here.
Fine, frisky.
Frisky.
Well, okay, you're going to mixed use residential in the middle of Shadycroft. You're following historic tendencies in Littleton here. So what you're talking about is what the Brown area, urban residential multifamily. It's already there to a great extent. So that's, you're not going out on a limb here too much.
But it's that good point by the council member that how do you let that evolve and not lose everybody that lives there right now? Not everybody, but people that are able to live there right now. I want to get your take on this too, Mark, because just if you affirm this as an architect, because I always had that conception that, yeah, the bigger the house, more costly. I've heard the opposite argument. If I'm doing patio homes or a number of units, that's more complicated construction, more meters to put in, there's more to the construction.
Square foot.
Chime in. I mean, the cost per square foot is more for a smaller residence. There are fixed costs to building anything.
Fixed costs, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a 3,000 square foot house is going to be a whole lot more than an 800 square foot house, but cost per square foot is more for that 800 square. You got the cost of land, blah, 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 et cetera.
So one of those public education points that bigger doesn't mean more expensive always.
No, but you're not going to get a 3,000 square foot home down to the price of one of our little buildings we have downtown that just got scraped. So, and we were talking about this before up in Loveland where they created, it's a mixed housing area. but they have the smaller homes. They have the smaller footprint. Some are 2, some are 1. And they are a lot cheaper than the bigger houses around them. That's my point. My point isn't that it's not going to be equal per se, but again, you know, in this little neighborhood, the yards were small. They didn't have a lot of yards. It was alley loaded. It's not going to fit in all places. But those homes were a heck of a lot cheaper than the homes around them that were bigger and had more. So,
is there a market for that? Definitely. You mentioned patio homes. If you built patio homes in Littleton, I've always said you'd sell out before you finish building each unit. There's a hell of a demand for it. Nice little house, maybe, give them 1,000 square feet, small patio in the back attached with a cluster of maybe 4 of those units, each one with a small backyard. One maybe two has a 1-car garage, the other 2 have 2-car. Bam! You'd sell them out. Find the land to do it, and a price that people can afford to downsize as they get older is a trickier matter.
So I've touched on the ones I wanted to revisit. So open forum. Oh, we got more time?
I had a question. This was more just of where we have all the different types of land use and their characters. And then, you know, of course we have a picture to show what it is. But sometimes on the map, because there's different colors and there's different hatchings and stuff, will there ever be a list saying under this type of, you know, let's just grab one out here. So under auto-oriented residence, here are on our map where those are. There's 3 of them, they're located here. So more like of a list instead of having to go on the map and try to figure out where it is.
Where they are in the text. You call them out. I think that would work in some cases, but then others are kind of multiple. I have to write that down.
Just as, and there might be some balance between it, because when I was reading through several of these, I'm going like, where is that? I can't quite tell because the hatching isn't, you know, again, sometimes it's just hard to distinguish with the different hash marks and stuff like that. Some are real obvious and some are not.
I think we had talked about that several weeks ago, about maybe being able to toggle the layers off and on the map if it's online.
Yeah.
So you can select only. Yeah.
Just so you know, so I'm just thinking if something ever comes before us and we're looking at it, it's nice to know where those are in the community so we can look at what's going on there. And there was just the one, that auto-oriented residential multifamily, where there wasn't an image. Would that eventually get an image, or?
Because there isn't an example in Littleton.
Yeah, I know, I was trying to, well, that was my whole thing, is where is that? Anyway, it just helps to clarify what this means, what this looks like. Because sometimes, like you say, some things look like they belong in both.
Mm-hmm. On the existing land use map, where's a good example? I think where that is. Could be this one. Well, I can't look at 2 things at once. Let's see.
Got a paper copy?
Yeah, I think we ended up putting that example in suburban, but it's one of those borderlines where on the existing land use map, we had shown this apartment development as auto-urban. Not a lot of green on that site. But when you see it from the street and the rest of the area around it, we went to the suburban category. But I mean, there's some apartment complexes as opposed to, let me call out another one, Ridge Road, I believe. This may not be apartments, but
you're looking for?
I did find an auto urban residential attached on the map. May not just have the aerials yet.
Yeah, so those are more like townhome, they're not apartment complexes. That's what I was looking for. So this is one example on Ridge Road where they did a nice job of internalizing the parking. And
that's one I was looking for.
It's green along Ridge Road on the frontage, then even some green space in the middle. So this is a good example of, you turn the site layout around, and in a lot of places, the parking would be around the edges. And, well, okay, let's go to one of those examples.
So in essence, like what Jason was saying, would there be a way like we could click on one of the characters and then the map would show these are where those are?
Yeah.
Especially
that would be
because it's all GIS layered, so I think that's something we can adapt from and kind of create that as an online tool.
That would be really pretty cool.
Yeah, some of the apartments along Federal are kind of walking that line.
So, yeah, so that's not auto urban right now. Why? I guess that was one of my questions: is how are you determining that? I mean, you're not physically going in and verifying that there's more pavement than green and building. It's just a visual.
See where we end up on the map. Can't do my iPad stuff.
It's up to the there we go. Right there.
Yep. Yeah. We ended up putting all this area in suburban, kind of playing off the river corridor and the golf course and everything that's nearby. If you took it site by site, yeah, some of these are really pushing that auto urban, but
density is.
Well, and I guess that was the thing this is in the future, right? If this were to be redeveloped, that you would push it to be more suburban residential or multifamily.
Right, that's the challenge of putting these designations on a mostly built city, but that's it. That this general area, because of the river proximity and kind of the flavor of the overall area, you'd hate to see a really obvious auto-oriented apartment complex built. I mean, these aren't bad at the end of the day. The landscaping's good, but anytime parking ends up right along the corridor, that whole stretch of parking versus that other example where they internalize the parking, just makes such a difference. And that makes, that fits so well with the Ridge Road atmosphere that, because it's mostly single family along there and very green. Uh-oh, Mark's studying the map.
So I had a question about just some of the, so we have state residential, I'm looking at suburban residential. I guess one question is why isn't suburban residential not just purely detached? Because the next bullet point, it talks about planned developments that may integrate, this is looking at primary land use types. Planned developments that may integrate other housing types, example, attached residential, which attached residential, I would look at being in suburban residential attached.
Yeah, because, and I'm actually got a meeting tomorrow night where may use some of our older plans when Lane Kendig, our founder, was still involved. 80% of Littleton would be in neighborhood conservation. I mean, that was his philosophy. If it's built, your job now is to maintain it and conserve those areas, or if they are going to turn over. But so when you don't do that, and one example I've used is the peninsula here, that housing. I mean, if you put it in suburban residential with all the large lot detached suburban homes in other areas of the city, it is a different use situation. It's attached homes in a fairly good density, but again, they benefit from having that reservoir right there at their front door, and just the openness of the green around it, the park, the Highline Canal Trail coming through. So we're kind of doing two things there. On the one hand, felt the need to call out areas that are already built in Littleton that are attached housing as opposed to apartment complexes, as opposed to single-family detached. But going forward, in character-based zoning, as I've shown examples, you wouldn't necessarily distinguish those. And so I use that, for those that may have been here at the last meeting, I use that example near Heritage High School, that if somebody bought up 3 estate lots and combined them and did 6 attached units, it would still be suburban residential if there's enough open space around them and buffering from the estate detached homes to the rear. We're dealing with this situation of a city that's mostly built, it is what it is, and there'll be evolution, but we thought it was important here because our statistic is 43%, I think, of the city's housing is attached housing types. Thought it was important to call that out on the map and really show where you've got established areas that are attached housing or apartments, but they fit just fine in an overall suburban character area. Where if we just painted that all the same yellow, you kind of lose some of that built detail that's already there.
Does attached mean 2, 3, or 4 units, basically?
Right.
If it's more than 4, it's...
I don't know that we called out a number of units in the description, but it's when you get into more of apartment complex type layouts, groupings of buildings. But then, there's, as Kathleen pointed out, I think last time we met, there's some great examples in Littleton of attached housing that it looks like one big house from a distance, but then you get up close and realize there's 4 units or more.
Isn't that the Peninsula kind of looks like that when you're driving?
The Peninsula, and there's
these huge houses.
Oh, it's in Trailmark. I didn't realize till we got right up on top of it that some of the housing in Trailmark, these things, those aren't mega houses, those are multi-units.
Stark Canyon.
I want to see where that is.
That whole area. So some of those single family units too are condo, townhome.
Yeah, and there's a couple of pods within Trailmark, but
yeah, those are each 8 units.
Like I say, we got in here and didn't realize till we got right up on them that those are multiple units.
Yeah, look at that.
But from a distance and from the overall community, they blend right in just fine.
Not a single family house with a 6-car garage? Okay.
Okay, that's we backed off of because so much of Littleton has front garages, but that's auto. It's in a suburban environment, gosh, with all this open space and the internal open space. I'm pointing at the screen again. All that internal open space and the open space around it, but boy, from a street, from a curb view, it was the one we were just looking at. Yeah, that's a big concrete pad out in front of that.
If Trailmark was there without that development, and that was an empty lot, and they tried to put that in today, it'd be a battle royale. We wouldn't get it. It'd be more single-family houses.
They actually do work in a more residential context. In Stapleton, they're planted mainly on intersections, so they kind of wrap the intersection with a massive home that has 6 or 8 units in it, and there's single family between them. So they can be dispersed. This is kind of clustered, which I don't know how that works.
The one thing that surprised me about Littleton or Stapleton, with all the good things about it, is it MLK that's the big road through the middle? That there's single family homes fronting out on that thing. Not quite new urban design.
Got some of that in the other arterials in Denver, like University.
So I have a question about auto-oriented. I mean, it seems like some of the descriptions that are being painted here, it doesn't sound awesome. So why does our plan continue to have auto-oriented if this is a future state?
Right. It is what it is, and let me go back to the map. The best example for me is this, Littleton, or Broadway at Mineral and County Line. That's a grocery shopping area, kind of your Walgreens, go pick up stuff, run in, run out. It's large retail centers. We kind of looked at it as it is what it is and got that affirmation in our table discussions, and when we had the advisory committee meeting, kind of the same feedback that it kind of is what it is, but then you've got the South Park interior with the standards and the covenants that they have that really keep that openness. I was just looking at another map from another community. This is in my computer. There are cities where the map might have 3 or 4 commercial properties that are called suburban commercial. That's it. And you just know in that environment that they're not going to make the transformation through new development or redevelopment to a high level of landscaping and leaving a lot of open space on sites. So it is what it is, and most of that city, to the point that some of you may remember that on the first draft of this map, we put general commercial. That's what we use in a lot of cities because of that negative connotation that we don't want our city to be auto-oriented. Well, guess what? It is, and it's probably always going to be that way. So we try and soften the terms, but yeah, we did call out some areas on this map that the new car dealership that's coming in here, kind of this cluster, and some of the other areas along Broadway.
So, I'm in District 1, so I was kind of focusing on that northwest area. So, Platte Canyon and Bellevue, that little sliver. I really don't want that to be the Bulls and Platte Canyon, the old Walmart. That's a tough retail spot. I would love for it to be more flexible. I guess that would be then mixed use. We don't want that to be auto urban anymore.
That's the feedback we need.
I have a lot of those, but I can send those later.
You got a little list, personal list.
Squiggles all that.
Take a picture of it and send it to us.
We got the new cocktail bar there, though. So.
I know. Check that out.
Yeah, and again, this is the kind of the difference of dealing with a city that's mostly built today and how aspirational you want to be on some of the areas.
And actually, the other thing I noticed, so auto urban sort of isn't pedestrian friendly, and so I'm just looking sort of at that district, but it's like a lot of those places down there would be awesome if it was more pedestrian friendly. I know people are always trying, walking to those places, so it'd be nice to encourage those to be more pedestrian friendly, which I think is in that mixed use. It's kind of like what you have Columbine Square as mixed use. It's like the logic would be, that triangle should be mixed use.
That Lowell Linden.
Yeah. Which those, like the surface lots.
It's surface lots now,
but thriving retail. Compared to sales tax receipts on
Dan, you're talking about
a lot.
The little triangles.
The triangle where Walters is.
Which is fully occupied. It's great C space, but it's occupied.
Two gas stations, which is weird, but
And that's part of it too on that particular one is because everything around it is suburban.
It's all paved.
We didn't do that one because it goes back to Mark's point, which was maybe more residential discussion, but with the land available to work with there and somebody trying to scrape and do new, can they make the economics work and fit the parking and leave some open space to make that a more green site?
town's nowhere near meeting our current parking requirements for that amount of retail.
So, the market decide, but
parking.
There's a lot of vacant parking there all the time too. So
it's an old shopping center.
the
right?
back side of it.
That's, Safeway. Yeah, that's a Safeway side.
So, I don't know if we've got that. We need to work it into the policy language that, yeah, it's a negative connotation, but it's how can you make it better through landscaping standards, design standards in some cases. But it's kind of those it is what it is situations. But with that being said, yeah, we need that feedback of where should we make some changes.
So just because it's red doesn't mean it can't become, the other color.
I guess that's my question. Or that else, if you leave it red, it's not, a developer can still go in and make it pedestrian friendly. But do they also go, oh, I can park a whole lot more if I want to, or I don't have to have as much open space?
I mean, this is going to work in tandem with the zoning, so the zoning's going to say what you can do.
That's while we're nitpicking the auto urban areas. Maybe the Village Park Drive just there north of Broadway and Dry Creek. I mean, I haven't seen the site plans for the commercial in there in that area, but it's classified, I think, as auto urban. And depending on how that's actually designed for the Starbucks and the future burger place, maybe it's actually a little more urban in terms of its connectivity to the neighborhood to the east.
Yeah, I think we were
and access from Broadway even. I haven't walked the site, so I don't know.
I think we were kind of biased by what's happened so far, but yeah.
I wonder what the intent was. These are two very different things.
What's happened? How it's playing out. Multiple uses on a site, I think is...
Can I ask another question about urban residential multifamily? It's page 11. It looks like the only place that occurs is at Bellevue.
Right.
And I was just trying to get rid of one of these land use names. I mean, why couldn't that just be corridor mixed use?
It could be. It's the one place in the city that's not in downtown or west downtown that's kind of that style of buildings out to the street, parking mostly internalized. Let me go back to the
But I can do that in mixed use, right? I mean, if I were to do a site plan, I could have the buildings out to the edge and parking internal.
Yeah, I mean that it's kind of introducing that designation in case it were to pop up somewhere else. I think there's definitely been some pushback of why are we putting corridor mixed use in? So that's part of the discussion too. But I'm open to.
It's just the only place in the city. I don't know why. I'm not sure why it's so special. Because I think, well, actually it sounds like it's because the buildings are to the street, but we may be encouraging that in other land use areas anyway.
And I think that corridor mixed use is coming up in those 4 key corridors. Influencing some of the work on the transportation master plan, right? Like even getting to a point that we're defining street types relative to character. So applying more context than you would normally do, like in transportation speak, when you would say arterial, like digging a little bit deeper and giving more context to that. So that's the direction that where that mixed-use corridor is where it is, so that context is very much a part of the transportation conversation, because those are especially those 4, so Littleton Boulevard, Broadway, Monroe, and Santa Fe are the ones that keep popping to the top in both conversations.
This is a good example I mentioned where you adopt the comp plan, the map categories, go through the zoning process, and then circle back and potentially make some adjustments to the land use map and the comp plan. I think this is one of those examples where have the discussion of what a standalone zoning district for this residential character would look like, in case you wanted it or it popped up somewhere else. If somebody wanted to rezone to that they have that option, where corridor mixed use might be a different set of considerations. I'm thinking out loud, but I think this is, it was very much on our mind that it's just one place on the map, but it's, could it show up in other places, and is corridor mixed use the only way to get there? And definitely not to have to do planned development on the zoning side. You know, the other ones that, I guess it's down in my neighborhood when I'm visiting, just what's happening down here. I guess that's, you know, those aren't quite as urban character, but, you know, if it did show up in some other places. I hear you on trying to get rid of another category. I agree with that.
But the picture matches the words so well in this category.
Okay, so I think I have one more. Speaking of pictures, so auto-oriented commercial, page 14. That's I know that Home Depot. So that's actually mixed use in land use. So I don't know if we just need to do a picture.
Thank you. Yes, that did change. Yep.
For you, Dan?
No, I don't know. Sure.
Oh, you pick your as you go down the list? Or?
I can show you the picture I'm going to swap in to replace that. Let's see, right up there. There we go. That'll work. Broadway, north of Littleton Boulevard, north of Powers.
Why do you bring this up?
Oh, I was saying because we need to use another image versus Home Depot. That's a good one.
Yes.
The antique one.
Yeah, the antique one.
Yeah, antique.
A former Safeway, right?
I had some comments on the opening paragraph on page 2, but I'm thinking that maybe it's something I should just email to you, kind of rewording and improving, making that a little stronger with reference to page 15, which discusses how some properties can kind of evolve and change into other types of uses. So I'm going to email it to you rather than discuss it.
Are there any other concerns? Go right down to anything else? Let's start with this side. Dave?
Anything else?
Okay.
Just one quote that comes out of residential mix that I really appreciated. It says, to live up to its core value of remaining an inclusive community, Littleton needs an area with varied housing that is attainable to people at or below the median income range. And that was sort of in the discussion of Northeast Littleton. I just appreciated that inclusion in the plan.
It's trying to connect the dots back to the vision statements.
Particularly the shared values.
Yep.
I had one. I was just looking, I didn't notice industrial uses. Is that intentional?
Yeah, I think in one of our meetings we had that discussion, but on the existing land use map, the only things we called out as industrial was the kind of that sand gravel type operation on Santa Fe, and I think one of the areas up at the north, like this area, I think we called out something industrial in here, but that was pretty much it. We started to put industrial on the Breckenridge Brewery, but then use the corridor mixed use designation along there.
But it would be a permitted use, I presume, when it comes to the zoning.
Right.
For that corridor specifically.
Yeah, and where it really might show up, light industry or warehouse, the south one, they're set up to deal with that from a standards standpoint. But right, we purposely did not put an industrial category.
I think it's that constant sensitivity of, are you talking character or are you talking use? Right?
Oh,
I mean, that's, it's still that institutional, it's not a character, right? So how you...
If you want 10 more categories on the map, we do rural industrial, urban industrial.
Ixnay on the
Auto subdivision industrial.
Is that what you're looking for in your head?
His neighborhood.
Yeah. Grain elevators out by the railroad tracks, out in the boonies is an industrial use.
Industrial.
Anything else here? Robin, you have something?
Yeah, it's something we briefly touched upon, but when you're looking at the Santa Fe corridor being up against South Suburban and the parkway there, you are going to be writing in the text about how that's different, because you talked about the corridors are different. So their text is really going to delineate here about, protecting the river and what we want to see with the river as that butts up against it.
Protecting and even orienting development toward.
Right. So that's where that conversation is going to occur.
All mixed use corridors are not alike.
Right. And the other thing I just heard from some others about, the residential just north of Aspen Grove and Walhurst, about protecting them in that mixed use area so they don't get lost or changed into something else, because someone I know happens to live there and they were concerned about that.
Good concern. Seems to be a fixture these days.
Fixtures change. Things get scraped.
I have to check what we wrote, because we didn't call out those specific properties, but it's part of that inclusiveness and gentrification type language.
It's further south.
Right, we got here, I guess.
That's the trailer.
That's a trailer. Whoop. You're fine.
Yes. And then
just about not losing them in that mix.
Oh, I thought it was the two.
I think that's. Which one you talking about?
They talked about both, actually.
Okay.
The mobile home.
Not losing those residential areas in the mix of things. And Mark has said this several times, too, in the conversation about Santa Fe. It's not the same. It's not uniform across the land. There's different parts of it are different. But those were called out to me by some that I wanted to make sure they weren't lost in the mix.
Well, is it proper to call out a specific area in the general colored area as this has to be protected? I don't think that's appropriate. Things change, like you just said. I mean, that site at...
Yeah, I'm not sure what that translates into. Does it translate into we're never going to rezone your property, or you can't sell it, or...
Yeah, you can't do that.
Well, why do we allow that, we have our suburban areas, we wouldn't allow that to be scraped and changed. What makes this different for these homes where they could suddenly be something different?
What could change is probably the zoning. What is the zoning of that corner?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate again, as I've said, that just because all this area is yellow shades, any of it could be scraped tomorrow.
Yes, but you have more options on the Perryville corridor than you do in those lands. Right now, they're zoned pretty specific for single-family homes.
I guess it would get into the realm of almost like historic designations or something to say that you can't.
I don't know if it's you can't, but just something to be thinking about is more.
Oh, yeah, and that's what I made a note of, to check what we said in the text as far as without calling out. I don't know if you call out the specific property and use.
Well, an issue with that.
Just say historic or long-established residential developments along this.
I mean, in some sense, you know, we're trying to preserve the northeast corner. What makes that more special than trying to preserve this little area here too? I mean, I don't know the answer. I'm just bringing up the concerns I've heard. Why is that different? You know, we're trying to preserve that with that mixed wire, and we're trying to preserve this little area where you have some potential for more affordability too. It's just something to think about.
It's kind of challenging because with the mobile home park, because typically those are all rental units. Somebody owns that whole piece of property, and certainly most mobile home parks around the metro area have been absorbed and scraped off. I mean, that has been a trend for years. We've lost a lot of affordable housing that has to do with mobile home communities, but that's a challenge in that is typically a private property owner that holds that entire site. They rent those lots. The mobile homes themselves are not real property; they're personal property. So it is a different animal in many ways. But I don't disagree by any means about trying to preserve some areas for mobile homes, because boy, once you lose those, you never ever get those back. It's just there's no place to put them. There's nobody. It's just not acceptable typically by the community. So I don't know. It's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Well, the existing zoning is PDR, and I've never read the requirements of that PDR district. To see, I mean, is it mobile home park period, or is it written that's multi-family residential? I don't know. You have to read it.
You should look, because
you should have your friend read the PDR.
Yep. Because I've worked in communities, obviously, where a lot of us have, where those that's happened. You know, the property owner decided to sell, and a lot of folks who lived there got displaced, which then leads to huge implications of trying to relocate all these people in their homes, or getting rid of those homes because there's nowhere to relocate. So, you know, it's a tough one.
Yeah, the difference for me is in the Northeast, it's a bunch of lots and properties and different developments, where this is a mobile home park, one entity. But I hear you. Note to self is, how did we word it in the text to get that point across about avoiding losing people and gentrification.
Maybe we need to do a little research on that one. Communities have been successful trying to preserve mobile home communities.
But just as if you read the PDR, if someone reads it, it could allow for, so let's say, a greater density or more affordable housing. It's a possibility versus what's there now. So who knows? You have to read it. The other mobile home park just north of the brewery is B2. That could be, the owner could sell that in New York 2nd, and you got B2 on that site. Any other comments? I have none, so thank you. We've got a couple other things to talk about.
I have one question. Are you tracking what, oh shoot, I just lost it. Land uses that were, original land uses that have changed to something else?
Oh, from the existing land use map?
Yeah, like so there's a landowner suddenly like, oh, I always was residential, but now I'm suburban retail, sweet. Or if it down zones.
It's not a zoning map.
So it's not, yeah. This is
It's just land.
right. So that's the next step.
But still, because so much is already on the ground, the corridor mixed use is the only one that's really different from what they might expect to see. That, I'm not in corridor residential or corridor commercial, but I'm not changing from what's already there. Now, the other caveat would be that institutional category that, if I'm a church pastor, I might say, my property is shown as residential. But that's how it's typically dealt with in zoning.
Well, I spent a lot of time looking at the zoning map, which it's on my wall. Anyway, and this map. And that's why I said this. You're not getting frisky here on massive changes to what's already in Littleton. I agree.
To be more frisky.
You're not going to live that one down.
Let's see, a couple other things. Thank you. We sent out a notice about legal training either July 17th or July 25th. Don't get that. And, you can avoid that.
Unless you want to dial in.
So, have we had massive sign-ups yet, or we're still working?
So I believe we're supposed to let Wendy or Becky, I think it's Becky, actually let Becky know which one you can attend so she makes sure she has enough rooms and all that sort of stuff. You do not need to attend both, but you need to attend one. So, it's mandatory.
25th.
25th. Okay.
I'll send an email.
Okay, yes. At least you don't make me be responsible for that.
Don't let him weasel out, all right?
So.
Second thing is, I got that email about you're going to be gone. Kathleen's going to be gone at our next meeting on the 22nd. There's no official business and no cases. I don't think you're coming back on the 22nd, so I don't think there'll be anybody against not having the meeting on the 22nd. We're going to have a very busy August 13th. I'm sorry?
Let's have a potluck.
Potluck? At your place, thanks. You provide the adult beverages. Yeah, all the food. Okay, great. His house.
Televised.
22nd.
So we're going to have a very busy August, so I don't think there's any objection. We'll not have our meeting on the 22nd.
I'll second that.
Yeah. Second that. I think it'd be unanimous. It's summer, enjoy your week off. Like I say, it's going to be a busy fall, busy late summer here, so that's all I have. Anything?
Yeah, just to go over that schedule. So then your packet for the 13th will include drafts of both of the documents. And then the 13th we'll kind of dig in on those and start that discussion. The official public comment period starts on August 14th, so the day after your joint leadership meeting, and then concludes September 16th. There's a couple of events that are just noteworthy. The first being the interactive street fair that we're going to host during the same day as the Criterium. So Saturday, August 3rd, it'll be from 3:30 to 6:30. We'll take over Nevada Street and kind of demo all the future land use map and some of the transportation elements. So we hope that you can join us for part of that. That'll be right before we have a draft, but I think it'll fit really nicely in that teeing people up for the public comment period opening. And then on August 28th, we're planning a telephone town hall to dig in on both plans. And then on September 12th will be the fourth and final speaker series for Envision. And that's the one with Peter Kajiyama, the author of For the Love of Cities. So,
What'd you say, which date is that?
that's Thursday, September 12th. That'll be in the evening, like about 6 to 8. And that'll be a great chance to potentially share some of the feedback that we've gotten through that open public comment period, but most importantly, it'll be that reminder that you still have a few days. So.
Is a sign up going out for that fourth meeting?
Not yet. We've been opening those about a month before. We're working, we have more space because we're going to be at the summit room at ACC. So, working with some partner organizations. If you have any thoughts about folks that we could get involved that love Littleton, we'd love to have a huge audience for the love of Littleton. So.
One last comment, the comprehensive plan, the outline, or I call it the skeletal outline. Thank you for getting that to us. You all got a copy at our last meeting, so to me it's checklist when I started looking at this comp plan draft as to how the bases covered. Does it cover the river? Does it cover downtown? Does it cover density? Does it cover discussion of ADU, whatever? Really important issues, as well as the our meat and potatoes land use map and land use character. That's all I have. Any other comments?
Does anybody want a fresh December 18 zoning map?
I've got.
You'll take it? All right, take her. Sold.
Okay. Well, good luck.
Thank you.
At your next adventure, and an open invitation to visit in Redwood Country.
Yeah.
So,
I'll keep in touch. I'll let you know where I end up.
Road trip.
yeah, road trip. Okay, thank you. We're adjourned.